got a forthcoming book, Defending Democracies, Combating Foreign Election Interference in a Digital Age. While at Temple right now, he's co-convening a role in the Oxford process, where he's focused on international law projects that are core to civilian functions, such as the healthcare sector, vaccine research, and elections, of course, and preventing cyber threats. In addition, he frequently consults with Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, and works with him on his digital peace team in issues of global cybersecurity. I look forward to hearing what Duncan has to say, and I now turn it over to you, Professor Hollis.
Thanks, Angie, and thanks to you all for having me today. I'll begin with a couple of brief caveats. One, as I mentioned to a few of the folks who before we formally started, thanks to a former student and the fact that I somehow seem to know something about foreign election interference, I got dragged in over the last couple of weeks to the boiler room for the PA Democratic Party here in Pennsylvania. And so other than a crash course in Pennsylvania election law, I'm a little ragged and have been working on a bunch of issues other than this. So I have a presentation and I'm going to try and be as coherent as possible, but I hope you'll give me a little slack. And also, if anyone feels free to weigh in on the Nevada things when we learn what's going on in Nevada or any other critical information, I'd really, would appreciate it actually. The second caveat is that I want to talk to you today about a chapter that I co-authored, and I co-authored it with Jan Neutze, who's the head of Microsoft's Defending Democracies program. And so, I should be clear that he and I did this together. I should also be clear, as Angie mentioned, that I do kind of consult. I do consult regularly for Microsoft, but my views and actually Jan's views are personal ones in this paper. And so nothing in them should be attributed to Microsoft in any way, shape, or form. So with that, I think what I wanted to talk to you today about a little bit is this idea of how do we think about foreign election interference and how do we regulate it, right? Like if we think of the idea of foreign election interference as a problem set, which is not terribly new, but it takes new forms in the online space. How can we regulate it? And the thesis of our chapter, as it were, is not terribly ambitious. It's mostly to say, hey, that whatever else you're doing, let's incorporate cyber norms, right? If we can construct cyber norms on foreign election interference, build a broad multi-stakeholder coalition, it could be one of the critical tools for impacting behavior, particularly of nation states. So in terms of how I want my talk to go here, I kind of break it into three parts. First, I want to talk about the inadequacy of existing responses. Why I think the way we respond, whether it's international law, domestic law, or technical responses, may be insufficient for purposes of regulating this threat. That's not to say that each of those isn't valuable, but we think they're insufficient. And I then want to talk about, well, what could norms do? And I'll unpack the norm concept, at least in a social science sense for all of us, particularly those who may not be as familiar with it. Although, given the setting and Ostrom and all that, I assume many of you will be pretty familiar with it, but I'll unpack it nonetheless. And then I want to talk about, well, what could it do in the cybersecurity context, in the global cybersecurity context, in particular with respect to the security of our democratic processes and elections, and how they can, protect us from foreign election interference. So just, say a word, as I mentioned already, foreign election interference has a long pedigree. Dov Levin, who wrote a chapter for our book, is a political scientist who's done a history of foreign election interference, cataloged, over 200 cases where the US or the Soviet Union, then Russia, interfered in foreign elections after World War II. So it's not an infrequent occurrence. I mean, maybe a little infrequent, at least for those of us in the US, was the fact that we could be a victim of it, right? And so well publicized, of course, is the allegations of Russian interference in the US 2016 presidential elections. They then went on also to be alleged to have involvements in the 2017 French national election. So this is not just a problem for the United States, although here in the US, our press, often casts everything in US terms, perhaps appropriately. Our British colleagues also are aware that there was disinformation and other campaigns by the Russians when it came to the UK Brexit vote. And I'm pretty pleased to say that, last month we saw some reports of Russian penetration into voter databases, and the Iranians apparently also got their hands on some voter information. It's not clear how serious the hacking was, but what is serious is then how they use that data. And so one of the things you may have seen was that there was a series of emails where Iranian operatives, not clear if they were proxies for the Iranian government or the Iranian government itself, posed as the quote unquote Proud Boys, a right-wing nationalist group here in the US that some have characterized as a hate group, and basically said, vote for Trump or else, right? And sent these emails to potential voters in various states. We can actually maybe talk, there's some news coming out that the US government, particularly US Cyber Command or others, may have done something in response to those stories. The news is still a little sketchy, but we could maybe, if we have time for Q&A, we could talk about what the either the legal consequences or what it says about Cybernorms that we see that sort of reaction. All right, so the question is, we have this threat where nation states are engaging in, and I should back up. One of the things we're seeing in a lot of this is penetration of electoral related machinery. So far what we've seen is kind of more espionage or more just access. We have happily not seen charges that vote tabulations are being altered or the aggregation of data is being affected in any way. But I would encompass that as obviously election interference. If you were to go into another state's electoral system and change the vote count, which we're all following here in the US, whatever side you're on pretty closely, that would be election interference. But also, targeting through online spread or amplification of information, where, when, and how voting is going to occur, all the way to doxing political campaign officials, as we saw, say, with John Podesta's emails, and having those released publicly at particular times to affect news cycles. We see this also a lot with social media, and I think most of us have seen the challenge we're having regulating domestic misinformation and disinformation, and what Twitter puts a label on or takes down, and what Facebook does, and the like. So with that kind of threat matrix, and maybe we can talk more about it in Q&A if people are interested. I think if you look across the how do we deal with it, there been three different kind of pathways. One is international law. The other is obviously to use domestic law. Could be US law, could be French law, British law, what have you. And then also technical measures, like what can the information communication technology companies out there do to help make elections more secure from foreign interference. And I think all three have made important contributions, but as I said already, I think they're all, in our chapter, we use the word dramatically inadequate. So I think, we clearly need more, which is the kind of the tee up for the paper's thesis, but let me walk through why I think these three have issues. So I think with international law, it's important to think about, yes, clearly international law can help regulate foreign election interference, right? It can speak, and already does speak in some ways, to things that states cannot do. Intervene in, you're not supposed to intervene in the internal affairs of another state, including its electoral processes. What intervene means is a little bit open to dispute. I'll say more about that in a second, but it's pretty clear. For example, you cannot hack another state's voting machines and flip the results, so to speak. You also can see international law in some senses telling states positive obligations. You have to, make sure your territory is not being the source for another state's efforts to, engage in prohibited behavior. And in some ways, international law offers kind of a remedial framework, right, where it provides a common language and also vehicles for, de-escalation and dispute settlement when kind of disputes arise as to, where that line from interference to public diplomacy lies, and the like. So I think, I want to start off here and say clearly, I think international law has a role to play. Actually, as Angie mentioned at the outset, I've worked with Harold Koh of Yale Law School and Dapo Akande at Oxford University, and we've kind of co-convened this thing we've called the Oxford process, where we bring together international lawyers and have governments kind of sit in a Chatham House format. That is, they can't talk about who they are, and they can't nothing can be attributed to them. But those meetings have led to a series of statements where we kind of come up with a consensus position of where international law is today. And so our first one was on cyber attacks on the healthcare sector. You may remember, particularly prominent in the news in the spring, and we've seen more recently hacking hospitals and the like, and how international law would prohibit states and state-sponsored actors from doing that sort of behavior, and what positive obligations other states had to cooperate with victims. The next one we did was on vaccine research. And then just the week before the US election, we did actually release an Oxford statement. It's called the third Oxford statement on the protections of international law against foreign election interference. And we put it out for open signature, and I think it has over 160 international lawyers. Only international lawyers are allowed to sign it, but 160 international lawyers kind of joining a consensus on the ways that I've listed here. International law can kind of prohibit certain activity and requires certain other acts. So I think it does a fair bit of work, but I think it's also clear that there are difficulties when it comes to what international law can do in this space. And the first to date has been silence. States themselves have been silent about international law violations when it comes to foreign election interference. So they, when states call out like violations, or they don't call out violations, what they do is they accuse another state of engaging in the behavior. So Obama goes to Putin and says, hey, we know you're interfering in our election. Putin doesn't do anything. He makes the charges public, as do members of the US intelligence community. But it's interesting that they say, this is, in violation of maybe international norms, more on that in a moment, but never say that it's a violation of international law. Right. So I think it's pretty significant that the US doesn't try and isolate out what's happening as a violation of international law. And that's been pretty consistent in all these accusations we've seen, again, with the Russians in France, with the Russians in the UK, even with the, the Iranians. There's the only time I think I've seen a statement where the UK assessed Russia had violated international law was in a slew of accusations against Russia targeting not only its industry, the World Anti-Doping Agency, and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which was doing investigations into the Salisbury poisonings. Now, in that accusation, they said it violates international law, but they didn't say which of those accusations was the one that breached international law, nor what international law was breached. And I think that's kind of problematic, especially if we think, international law, if states do something and other states don't object, does that constitute kind of building towards some sort of permissive customary rule where these activities are not, maybe awful, but they're lawful? We have seen a number of states, particularly in the West, begin to break their silence by issuing kind of 3 to 5 page statements on how they understand international law applies to cyberspace, beginning actually with the US, then the UK, France, the Netherlands, Finland, most recently a couple of weeks ago. Iran has weighed in, but by and large, out of the 190 plus states out there, it's still a relatively small handful of states that have actually even said anything beyond kind of a platitude. Oh yeah, international law applies in cyberspace, but how it applies, we have a lot of silence. Then part of that silence may be fueled by what I'd call an existential debate, that even as we've seen states at the UN General Assembly and elsewhere agree that international law applies, there's a lot of debate about, well, which international law rules apply, and fights over certain rules that are said to not exist when it comes to cyberspace, taking, the whole conversation about how to interpret them or how to apply them off the table. China and Russia quite prominently have questioned whether the laws of war, or IHL, international humanitarian law, exist when it comes to behavior in cyberspace. Self-defense in response to like an armed attack, similarly, there's been challenges. Whether there's countermeasures, which are otherwise unlawful acts that a state commits in response to a prior illegal behavior, right? It's kind of international law allows a tit for tat. If your international law rights are violated, you have a right to take countermeasures and do things that would otherwise be unlawful, but because you're coming second, international law permits it. And there's some debate about whether that applies with respect to operations in cyberspace involving states. And then finally, due diligence. Does this idea that states have an obligation to ensure their territory or jurisdictions not used to abuse the rights of third states, right? That, this originated with the idea that like Canada has to make sure that its factories don't cause acid rain in the United States or pollute, or the US doesn't pollute Canadian rivers and the like. And that's expanded, to other things. And the question is, does due diligence also mean cyber malware and nastiness? Do states have to clean that up? Even where states agree there's international law, like that duty of non-intervention I mentioned earlier, we see a fair bit of disagreement among the states engaged in the conversation, those handful that have issued statements about what it means, right? What's required for for there to be intervention. Propaganda is kind of considered okay. And where's the line to when you're actually, coercing, for example, another state into doing something it would otherwise be free not to do. Similarly, this idea of sovereignty in cyberspace is under a lot of an interpretive cloud with kind of two groups. Some who see sovereignty as a fundamental principle that informs rules like the duty of non-intervention, but not a standalone rule. Whereas others point to the fact that, like, when it comes to aircraft, you have a wingtip rule that if a state's aircraft, even its wingtip goes into another state's airspace, that's a violation of its sovereignty. And there's a question of whether that applies in cyberspace, right? Is there a standalone rule of sovereignty, or can sovereignty be interpreted to apply where some states' cyber operations transit your networks or your routers or what have you? Will that be a breach of international law? And then finally, we have attribution issues, right? Now, obviously, there's the basic whodunit question. What machines were involved at a technical level, what users were operating the machines that launched the cyber operation, and whether there was any legal responsibility. And in international law, the legal responsibility is tricky because states are obviously responsible for their behavior, but in cyberspace, we see a lot of states facilitating behavior by proxy actors. And international law has said, well, you're only liable when you control those actors. And that raises the whole sort of kind of mafia-esque thing of what happens when a state says, oh, we don't care what you do, we won't arrest you, and it would be sure good if bad things happen in Philadelphia, for example, in the election or something like that. There does seem to be a real sense that when it comes to international law, certain states are aware of where these lines might be, and they've designed their support for proxy actors to go below that line and yet still be pretty effective in ways that are of concern. There's also the problem that international law is a slow-moving beast. If you want to clarify the law or even adopt new law, treaties take the consent of states. If a state doesn't consent to a treaty, it's not bound by it. Customary international law requires a general and uniform practice of a majority, if not most, nation states. Some states can persistently object, but like most states have to get there. And it's not just you do stuff, your state practice, but you have to do it out of a sense of legal obligation, and that can take time to suss out. So international law plays an important role here, but certainly not a complete one. Domestic law, I think, offers an alternative that we can think and talk about. Clearly criminal laws can target individuals, as we saw with a running series of indictments coming from the 2016 Russian interference, Russians associated with both the GRU, Russian military intel, and the Internet Research Agency, a troll farm in St. Petersburg. You can also regulate intermediaries, right? Domestic law can say, hey, maybe we're not the best one to deal with this, but Facebook and Twitter, we need to think about, your Section 230 liability. And that's been in dispute of whether the domestic law should be changed to impose, obligations to control content on these social media companies, who, by the way, also themselves can take advantage of domestic law to deal with these issues through terms of service. And I think a lot of what we're seeing about Twitter taking down tweets, blocking or labeling tweets is all by pointing to, you made a contract with us, you agreed to these terms, and you're not abiding by them. And in theory, you could go all the way to court to enforce the terms of service, as it were. Domestic law can also do things like registering foreign agents. So, who are your agents? Who are your lobbyists in a country, and the like? Excuse me. And tort law, right? Like we saw actually in concert with the election interference, this idea that privacy had been invaded by some of the people who were doxxed and they wanted to sue. The DNC claimed an invasion of its privacy and wanted to sue. So I think it has a fair number of domestic law positive contributions, right? It's less existential ambiguity. We tend to be able to identify that domestic law pretty easily because we have a constitution and other states have constitutions that tell us how the law gets made. You don't need that collective state consent. One state alone can make a decision on domestic law and put it in place. And we have well-developed judicial and other processes for enforcement, right? So we know, criminal law, if you can get the person, can, put people in jail or fines can be assessed and the like. The gaps, though, if we're concerned about foreign states interfering in other foreign states' electoral processes, the problem is that domestic law gets us the individuals, the agents of those states. But, as people have pointed out, like, if North Korea is doing something to interfere in our elections, you indict the poor person, that person's going to disappear, right? Like, or in other cases, they may, they're not going to actually, appear before a U.S. court and the like. And, in some ways, what we really want to do is change the institutional of the state and its behavior, because they can always find more hackers. They can always bring more people into the project. Sovereign immunity is a big problem. So like if you actually, as the DNC did sue Russia for an invasion of privacy, Russia says we have sovereign immunity, and US law seems pretty clear that they probably do have it. So domestic law has a limited ability to reach targeting states themselves directly. And with respect to those individuals, enforcing US law is hard. The US can't send the FBI into Moscow to grab somebody without, violating international law, and US law doesn't extend that far. There are mutual legal assistance and extradition treaties out there, but talk to any law enforcement expert who deals with them, and they'll tell you they're pretty dated. They're a patchwork, so they say different things for different countries, and there's a lot of loopholes in them for exceptions for quote unquote political crimes and the like. So, the US and Russia have a mutual legal assistance treaty that has done very little to sort out what happened or did not happen in 2016 with our election. And so, absent some real reform there, it's not clear how much work they can do. And finally, like a lot of what we're talking and people are worried about isn't even regulated by domestic law, right? Like a lot of, these bot armies on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram or whatever, and amplification of material, isn't the subject of existing law. And so there's some real gaps there. And so, again, has some potential, but not a complete solution. I should also say that the pressure to expand domestic law, right, and make domestic law, be more rigorous against foreign election interference also runs up against the challenge of how do you do so consistent with human rights? How do you regulate what's being put online without violating either in the US First Amendment rights or internationally human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, privacy, and the like. So then we got the technical solutions. What can we do technically to deal with this problem? One, obviously, the election infrastructure is increasingly technology-based. There are still some paper ballots. I'll say that a bit about more of that in a second, but I assume most of you voted in the last week or so. Maybe you did a mail-in ballot, but if you voted in person, it was a machine by in all likelihood that you were voting on. Technically, maybe we can do more defensively to protect campaigns from being doxxed or targeted, and also just using technology and algorithms to identify and maybe respond to foreign influence operations, right? The algorithms say, hey, this is a tweet, appears to be from a bot, appears to be misinformation from a bad source, and just scrubs it because things in cyber move so fast that you can't necessarily wait for human review. Although Facebook and others, they are trying to do that, which puts also some strain on the system. Again, this is more Jan's part of the paper than mine, so I'm going to be a little briefer here. I just would say, the solutions like domestic law and international law, a bit incomplete. First of all, so much infrastructure when it comes to elections is outdated. So I don't have any data on how old the machines were that we used in 2020, but look at 2018, still more than a third of the people were using old systems that are hard to patch and have insecurities. And there are still plenty of people voting on electronically on systems that leave no paper record. So there's no, verifying that vote was what you voted is somewhat difficult. 16 million is not a huge part of the U.S. population, but as we see, narrow margins are increasingly important in sorting out how democracy works in our polity. Adopting new technology is also hard, right? There's just a legacy path dependency where getting even as Microsoft, for example, has this free end-to-end voting encryption system, right? Where you actually kind of almost like your FedEx package, you vote, you get a barcode that's encrypted. The other end gets it, and you can verify that you voted. They can verify that you were a legitimate voter without revealing your identity. So there are some technologies out there that could be put to work. Google, Facebook, have Project Shield and Project Facebook, which are designed to give campaigns assistance on when they're being targeted by state actor level threats and helping protect cloud-based data and the like. And the reality is there's some acquisition and adoption of it, but probably not enough to be a holistic solution. And then there, the problem sets keep changing. The reality is both on things like encryption and then verifiability is that the very things you do to kind of preserve and protect, the other side can take reverse engineer and come up with new threats. And so, we started to see more in this last election cycle of these deep fakes, manipulation of videos to make somebody look drunk or say something they didn't necessarily say. And the technology therefore can be as much of a weapon here as it can be a solution. And so again, just like domestic law, international law, I think, technology is an important part of the regulatory picture, but it's not a complete one. So Cybernorms. So let me just see how we're doing. Okay on time, I hope. I think with Cybernorms, this is an idea that's been around for a while, and we have Peter Katzenstein's kind of a famous definition of what a norm is in social science, right? Collective expectations for the proper behavior of actors with a given identity, right? So it's a sociological construct that we've brought into international relations and increasingly international law. I tend to, in some work I've done with Martha Finnemore, a political scientist at GW, we break the norm concept up actually into 4 ingredients: identity, behavior, collective expectations, and propriety. Identity is this idea that norms are associated with a particular group or community. So norms can, there can be a norm in the family. You put your dishes in the dishwasher after dinner. You dress in a certain way. We have norms in the classroom. You'll do your homework. You'll respond when I ask you a question. Doctors have norms, lawyers have norms, and so do institutions, right? There are particular groups or communities who, by identifying as part of a group of a community, right, then kind of brings with it certain behavioral expectations. Like if I am a responsible lawyer, I'm going to follow the professional rules of responsibility. If I'm a responsible state, I'm going to follow international law. I'm going to do certain things and not do certain things. And it's, part of it is all motivated by this social pressures where you want to be able to maintain your identity as a responsible state, a liberal democratic state, or just a nation state, right? Just this is what nation states do. That's going to compel you to conform to these norms, or maybe like tamp down your tendency to deviate from them. And so, it actually, in many contexts can have consequential impacts on behavior, whether it's because of your own self-identity and you value it, or because you're afraid of what others in the community might do if you're regarded as a norm violator, as it were. Norms can regulate behavior much the same way, for example, that I've already outlined law can, right? Norms can be proscriptive, prescriptive, or permissive. What you shouldn't do, what you should do, what you may do, right? So sometimes it's things that you're not required to do, but if you do them, it's okay. And so, we can see norms kind of regulating behavior, telling, it's a who does what. Norms tell us who does what group is going to engage in what sort of behavior. And then the other thing that norms are interesting for is, right, they're intersubjective. Like norms are not unilateral fiats. They're not because I say it, it is the rule, right? They have to be shared expectations that people adjust their behavior because they have that behavior and they share that understanding with other members of the community. And that shared understanding may also exist outside of the community. We expect doctors to, they have their own internal norms, and then we as patients expect them to follow the norms of their community and how they interact with us. And they exist because the members of the community believe they exist, right? Like they are kind of, again, in that sense, driven by sociological pressures and positive reinforcement. How much they are, we'd say, internalized can vary, right? So the fully internalized norm is kind of the gold standard, right? You want, when I tell my kids, don't run around the house with scissors, I want them to not run around the house with scissors, obviously when I'm watching, but it's also the sort of thing I want them to internalize it so that they don't do it when no one's watching, right? That's the best norm is one that, you obey because it's a sense of who you are. And you internalize it. Internationally, like culturally, we see this, different cultures have different sorts of full internalization. My favorite example is like jaywalking. If you ever go to Germany, it's 2 a.m, you're alone at a stoplight, maybe one other German's there with you, and the light turns, the walk light turns red. No cars in sight. That person will stand there and wait for that sign to turn green without walking across, even though there's no one there to observe the violation. On the other end, there would be what, Cass Sunstein calls incompletely theorized agreements, where we all agree on the behavior, but we very much differ on why we're doing it. I like his example of religious peace. We are religious freedom. We all support religious freedom, whether it's out to get to practice our own religion, whether it's for moral Kantian based values, or like the national security types would say, oh, we want religious freedom because it preserves the social peace. Very different rationales, but all come to a shared norm. And then there's the lip service, where people say they agree that there's a norm, but then their actual behavior may deviate from it when people aren't watching or what have you. But even lip service, don't be too quick to dismiss it. I think for starters, we've seen over time that the cognitive dissonance of having to say one thing and do another can even affect institutions. Sometimes institutions, to overcome that, will say, oh, well, we're going to have an office that will handle human rights, as the Soviet Union did after the Helsinki Accords. And that office ended up having some real world impacts on Soviet policy towards human rights, certainly not as much as others would have liked, but probably more than in the absence of that organizational input. And similarly, I think when we think about lip service, it also may, constrain the extent of deviation. So I use speed limits in my chapter to talk about how, everybody speeds, at least everybody I know speeds. But what's interesting is people don't speed as fast as their cars will go, right? They speed in some relationship to what the norm is, to the speed limit, as it were. And maybe that's driven out of fear of sanctions under law, but there is also kind of a normative quality here that undergirds it, that I think that norms, whether they're in law or outside law, have that effect on constraining behavior, even if they don't generate full conformity. Finally, propriety. Norms come from a lot of places, so they can come from law, right? We can identify, effective laws are normative, right? That because it's a law and it's effective, people will follow it. But norms also, as I said, come from culture. They can come from your religion. They can come from professional standards, from being identified with a particular profession. And in international relations, again, there are a whole bunch of different kind of political-based, international politics-based norms, where it comes out of agreement, where if a bunch of states agree that something's a norm, that can be the beginning of the normative process. Now, how do norms form? Habit or entrepreneurs, right? Habit is if we do something long enough, it just, if you ever go to like a week-long conference, everybody sits in a seat the first day and it's kind of random, but then, tendency is people tend to sit in that seat again and again and again. And so that by like Friday, if somebody like sits in Joe's or Jane's seat, everybody else is going to be like, what are you doing? Like just habit sometimes creates, expectations of proper behavior. But the one that's more interesting for my purposes is norm entrepreneurs, where either a member of the community or somebody from outside the community says, hey, community of states or information communication technologies, you should follow this behavior because it's proper. I think, again, whether it's by habit or repetition, what we're looking for is this idea that it becomes normal. It's expected. Not that it won't be expected and happen 100% of the time, but this will be the general way that states or other stakeholders behave, right? And especially in cyberspace, where attribution is such a problem, one of the real attractions of norms is that, if you can get it fully internalized, states will do it even when no other state is watching them, and even when they think they can act anonymously. Norms can be brought about by these norm entrepreneurs by incentives, bribes, carrots, sticks, threatens, sanctions and the like. Sometimes norms can be brought about by persuasion. Just think back to the landmines campaign in the 1990s, where Princess Diana and a number of other, pretty influential figures persuaded many domestic populations that landmines were not just some technical tool of war, but a real human rights threat that hurt children and the like, and persuaded people who then persuaded their governments to undertake a convention that has by and large reduced the use of landmines throughout the globe. Even the US, which never signed on the treaty, only has landmines in the North Korean peninsula and has said as a matter of policy, it won't do them anywhere else. And then socialization, right? This is much more of the, branding rogue actors as rogues, identifying best practices. This is what good states do. This is, responsible states have computer emergency response teams, for example, and responsible states, do not, even hack, foreign states' election machines and the like. So I think when we think about cyber norms, particularly in the electoral context, one of the things that appeals to me is that the community doesn't just have to be nation states, that when we're thinking about foreign election interference, we can kind of think across a range of groups where we might want norms to be either clarified or developed from scratch or shifted in some way. Obviously, we want, we might want certain nation states to kind of coalesce around the things they will do and not do. But we also might want cyber norms on foreign election interference for information communication technologies, for election infrastructure vendors, for campaign officials, right? Like getting them to say, hey, even if I'm given this data, if I know that it came from a hack affiliated with a foreign government or a government-sponsored actor, I'm not going to use it, right? Like, so it's kind of foregoing something, building up those sorts of norms could go a fair bit of the way to addressing the problem or some of the problems here beyond what we've seen law and technology do so far. You can bring norms into existing communities. So, whether it's the United Nations, you can try and say, hey, members of the United Nations, this is what you do. Or members of FIRST, which is the Organization of Computer Emergency Response Teams, this is what you do. Or there's a cybersecurity tech accord, a bunch of the tech companies like Microsoft, Facebook, and the like, they can have these sorts of projects about how are we going to engage on foreign election interference, or you can stand up new ones. So I would note Indiana University and Temple University are both signatories of the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which is celebrating its 2-year anniversary this month, has over 1,000 signatories, including like 75 governments, a bunch of US state governments, industry and universities and the like. And it has a provision on assisting and strengthening measures to combat foreign election interference. And so, it was stood up new and to try and create a new community that cuts across some of these silos and addresses things. Cyber norms, just like law, also don't have to be always prescriptive, right? They can drive cooperation, or also I think they can block the formation of behavior. So I said earlier, right, that it's kind of depressing to some international lawyers that every time there's an accusation of some state, Russia, China, Iran, interfering in another state's elections, the accusation's there, but there's no legal rhetoric. At a minimum, though, we might say that those accusations are a signal in the normative space, right? That they signal the preclusion of the idea that this is appropriate behavior, this is okay behavior. And so in that sense, it may not, they're of real value in that they kind of have a blocking effect, as it were. I recognize that cyber norms are not a salve for all wounds. They have a lot of issues on their own. They have what I call identity failures. So, you might get a cyber norm, but maybe it's for the wrong group. So in addition to the Paris Call, the G7 has a statement on protecting elections from foreign election or interference online. The problem is the G7 is not the group of states that we have to worry about engaging in that behavior. And so, Russia's not a part of it. China's, not in. And so you might have a norm develop, but it's for the wrong group in terms of actually dealing with the problem set. And even if you have the right group, hey, all nation states should forego intervening in the internal affairs of another state. You have rogue actors, right? You have actors that, don't value their membership in the community enough to abide. And so cyber norms, are not going to be as effective with rogue actors. On the other hand, they may still have value precisely because they allow the non-rogue actors to work on positive obligations to cooperate and remediate threats when they do arise. Norms, like law, are going to have existential questions. Is there a norm? Is there not? Or interpretive questions. Okay, there's this norm. I'm not supposed to intervene in a foreign election, or I'm supposed to engage in due diligence with respect to election threats. There's still the interpretive challenge of, well, what precisely are you supposed to do or not do. And finally, norms may be, in some ways, they're very dynamic. They have the advantage over law that they can be stood up and coalesced around without all the processes of, Senate advice and consent or 190 states agreeing on something through customary international law. And so they're fast, but they may also not last as long. So on commercial cyber espionage, for example, the US and China in 2015 agreed they were going to forego spying to steal commercial information for commercial benefit. The G20 signed on, it looked great. And then Trump comes in and China starts basically just doing what they've been doing before and kind of signaling that, norms can start to form, they can fail. We may never get the norm at all. Or even if you get a norm, it could, be less permanent or exert less a pull than some of these other regulatory solutions I've mentioned. But I don't think the challenges are unique or insurmountable. Violators, we have criminals, we have states that have violated other international law for centuries. That doesn't mean that international law isn't of value. We have existential and interpretive issues in like international law, just like we have in the normative space. And fragility and permanence are also, kind of commonplace. So I think when it comes to norms, these are challenges, and I don't want to present cyber norms as some sort of silver bullet solution, but we also don't want to suggest that that they're irrelevant either. And the whole point of the piece is to kind of flag what they can do. Kind of running here to the end, I think the other piece of it is that cyber norms can work with law, right? The goal of most norm entrepreneurs is often to get their norm instantiated in law. And lawyers, we tend not to forget this. What we want out of law is we want law to be normative, right? We don't want laws in the books that people don't follow, right? And so there's this, interrelationship between the two, but they're different, right? You can have norms that exist outside of law, and you can have laws that are not normative, right? So they're mutually influential relationship. But I do think when it comes to like international law, norms can have value, right? They can start the practice that forms part of customary international law if you add like that sense of obligation onto it. So, you get a norm up and running, it can be kind of a stepping stone to the creation of law. Also, norms in the international space may lead states to enact domestic law. So like, there's a normative effort around blood diamonds for a bunch of years, the Kimberley process that states have taken, and it's not binding under international law, but they've created binding domestic law rules that bring it to bear. Nothing about cyber norms, I think, is competitive with using international law or domestic law. And in fact, they may be ways to kind of be more dynamic without necessarily getting in the way of having domestic law or international law wrap around this. And I think the Paris Call, Principle 3, and the Charlevoix Commitment, I already mentioned, do both that. Again, norms can lead to law eventually, right? So they can be a precursor, they can be a stepping stone, and they can also just kind of restrain otherwise available technologies. So, just because the technology is there doesn't mean we have to use it. So you've seen, for example, norms building around, let's not use deepfake technology as part of law enforcement. Just like for years, we've seen the aviation industry saying, yeah, even though we could fly drone planes with people in it, with civilians in it, we're not going to do that, right? We have the technology, but the norm is to not use that technology. And so I think there's, some possible things to plumb here for foreign election interference. The Paris Call, I think, is an important norm candidate. I don't want to say that this Principle 3 is itself a norm. I think it's a norm candidate. It's being put together, promoted to strengthen capacity to combat foreign election interference. And I think it does some of the sorts of expectations that I've already outlined, right? Tells us what not to do, tells us, how you're not supposed to do it. And, also has some positive acts that are wrapped up in here in the sorts of cooperation and assistance that we might expect. I'd note that there are now a couple of champions of the Paris Call. So Microsoft, the Alliance for Securing Democracies, led by Laura Rosenberg, and most recently the Canadian government have kind of all coalesced and said, hey, let's take this Paris Call Principle 3 and let's build a community around this, and let's see if we can't get this norm internalized among the signatories of the Paris Call. And there may be variations in the norm for different parts of the community. So there may be things that this norm directs ICTs to do versus what states should do and the like. And also a way to kind of work through interpretation and application issues. Like, what do we mean when we say malign interference? What are electoral processes? What fall inside or outside of that bucket? And, also maybe identify areas where, norms may not be enough, and maybe we need more domestic law or model laws, and maybe we may need more international law. And so I think one of the nice things about these kind of normative projects is they can serve, as a resource for building a community of experts and the like. And I think, time will tell, the Paris Call is pretty young. It's only 2 years old, whether the strength of people's ties to it and the depth of the commitment will move from just being words on paper to that collective expectation for proper behavior of those who associate or identify signatories to it. So I went on actually a little longer than I thought. So let me stop here and see if there's any questions or feedback. I hope I haven't bored you. I have had my, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I have not, for the first 45 minutes in the last 4 days, looked at Twitter or anything while I was talking to you, and the world may have changed as I've blathered on here. So hopefully that's nothing too major has happened, but let me stop and see if you guys have any questions or thoughts.
Well, Duncan, Joe Tomaine here, and I apologize for being late. I had a class, but thank you so much for being here. I have done even more than you. I haven't looked at the news for a long time because it's too scary for me, but I'm looking forward to looking at it later today. So questions, I see Michael McGinnis has his hand up, and Michael, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting talk, Professor Hollis, and I read your paper just a few minutes before you started talking. I didn't get all the way to the end, so. But I really like the way you structured the argument and you lay out the various sorts of points. And one of the points that really struck me in your paper was that you cited the Mueller report several times about how the Russians who were intervening, who were claiming to have interfered in the U.S. election, were very careful not to violate U.S. law. And I found that kind of puzzling. And that got me thinking in another direction, where I ended up sort of a different place than you ended up in on this. The Russians also didn't say anything in their interference that was any more crazy or outright lies than domestic actors were doing in the United States. And they weren't saying anything worse than people in the in that particular case, the right wing opponents of Biden and things like that. I mean, they weren't saying anything different from domestic actors. So it seems to me that when you look at cyber norms and the relevance in here, the source of propriety might not be the questions of sovereignty violations coming from international law, but rather violation of sort of good practices of civic discourse in the United States, and not being respectful of one's opponents and not using outright lies. Freedom of speech is one thing, but you shouldn't be able to just lie and make comments that have absolutely no validity in reality. And so it seems to me that if you look at cyber norms in the foreign interference, it might be very closely tied to the whole question of how do we enact better civic practices domestically in civic discourse. Now that makes the problem probably a little harder to solve than a question of sovereignty, but I'd like to get your reaction as to whether that might be the more appropriate source of where the propriety norm, source of norms will come from than from international law.
So thank you for the question. I think I'm largely in agreement with you on the need for a national dialogue, and whether it's normative or federal law or more state law on how we deal with communicating around elections and campaigning in the US is desperately needed, right? And so I don't dismiss that there's a problem of what we might call domestic election interference. And in fact, one of the things you saw after the Mueller report, like particularly in like Doug Jones's election in Alabama and the like, was people in the US started to mimic what they had found out that the Russians had done. They were like, that's great, we could do that. And I think that's problematic, and I think it's a real problem, and I think it needs to be solved. I think one of the advantages of cyber norms, as I said, is though that you can target norms for certain groups and for certain problem sets. And here, I think foreign election interference is a qualitatively different problem than domestic election interference because, and I'll flag Jens Olin, who's my co-editor on the book that we're doing, as kind of being a leading proponent of that. You have the issue of self-determination, right? That under international law, every nation state, and the reason we have a duty of non-intervention is every state's supposed to settle for itself how it wants to rule itself. So there's not even, although Tom Frank years ago argued that there was a right to democracy, maybe it's there, maybe it's not, but like in theory, every state should determine for itself how it should govern. And I think what foreign election interference does is it undercuts that, particularly, certainly if you switch the votes, right? And the polity picks one person and then the external actor comes in and says, no, you didn't elect candidate A, you elected candidate B. Like that clearly violates that self-determination right. But even in the misinformation, disinformation space, I mean, it's one thing for domestic actors to amplify and spread misinformation, to dox people and the like. And it's quite another when it's a foreign actor doing it, because of course, on one side or the other, it amplifies those things and kind of, I think, unfairly interferes with how we have this discourse, which may be obviously pretty strained and pretty divided in the US. And so I just kind of at the end say, look, we're having enough trouble. We're 50-50, 52, 48, 57, wherever we are, this is not a conversation between 90 and 10. Right. And so we're having this, let's figure it out ourselves. We do not need other actors coming in and bringing things to bear as like, prospects for resolution come forward. One actor, foreign actors could come in and try and, unsettle and drive people to the polls. And clearly that was what we saw Russia was doing in 2016. We did not see as much of it in 2020. There was much more of a threat and, query that's, because, for example, there was the notion that the U.S. was going to engage in persistent defensive activity and may have done some things, to reduce that. I don't know if one of the great things about 2018 was the U.S. Cyber Command apparently just texted all the Russian operators in the Internet Research Agency, or many of them, and just gave them a text on their personal home phones and said, hi, just wanted you to know, this is, the NSA. We just want to let you know where you work 9 to 5. And, just be aware, right? And like, it kind of circumvented the whole Russian state and all the diplomacy of like, you shouldn't do this. Oh, we never do this. And all that. And it just cut through, and that creates a bureaucratic problem. Maybe not as much in Russia where everybody kind of adheres or gets, maybe less free to speak out, but it creates problems. And so, maybe it's a little bit of that. We don't know, for example, what the U.S. did in response to Iran and the Proud Boys story, but reports are they did something. So, I think, one of the things about this norm building I said is, how do you build norms? Well, one is a little bit of coercion, right? Like you say, not only is this the proper behavior, but like deviations will not be tolerated and we're going to take steps to respond. So thanks, but great question. And I think you're right. Like increasingly talking about foreign election interference without at least acknowledging that we have a domestic election interference issue. I don't want to know if it's a problem, but we have an issue. We have to figure out that as well.
Okay, thanks.
Scott Shackelford, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Joe. And fantastic talk, Duncan. Really appreciate you taking the time during these very busy days. I want to make sure we have time to get to Asif and Hans and everybody. So a lot I could ask, but just really briefly. Number one, you just kind of brought up the idea of us becoming, frankly, a bit more assertive with regards to shutting down some of these attempts at interfering with our elections with this new defend forward idea since 2018. Other countries are following suit. So as we think about cyber norms, is that idea of active defense in the name of collective cybersecurity something that you feel comfortable governments pushing, or is that going to contribute to, frankly, greater collective insecurity in this space? And then only one other question as well. Critical infrastructure protection is often brought up in the context of one of those low-hanging fruit options for cyber norms. We can all get behind that. But as you said, it's been tough to operationalize, right, through these various UN processes, et cetera. So I wanted to get your thoughts. How many, is it very common? Because in my view, it's not very common for countries to have designated their election infrastructure as critical infrastructure. If not, by doing so, maybe through one of these UN processes, would that be a way to help kind of galvanize support and attention to that idea? And maybe, have it go forward as part of the Paris Forum or otherwise. Any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah. So first of all, I'll kind of go in, I think I'll go in reverse order, which may mean I'll forget the first one and you'll remind me. Critical infrastructure protection, I think, first of all, you have done a lot of scholarship and work on this, so that needs to be acknowledged. I think you're right in terms of, look, the US didn't designate its electoral processes as critical infrastructure until after we got hit. And I think that's kind of been the pattern, is that when it comes to norms on critical infrastructure, we've had a definitional problem. What are we gonna, what do we mean by the term? Like what's in the bucket and what's out? And boy, the diplomatic dialogue just gets stuck on that, right? Like that's your, and by the way, that's the classic Russian or Chinese response. Oh, you say we should have this norm to protect it. What do you mean? And then 4 hours later, we're still like trying to figure out what's on the list. And if something's not on the list, does that mean it's now permitted to go after it and all of that? And then there is the second part of how do you operationalize it? Like it's one thing to say, hey, critical infrastructure companies, you need to, up your cybersecurity against not just run-of-the-mill cyber threats, but high-level cyber threats. And then to actually do it. In much the same way, it's nice for social media companies to say, hey, we have a norm against, unauthentic, behavior. They have a specific phrase I'm forgetting right now. Like they say it, but like operationalizing it, how do you identify and take that stuff down is hard. So I think, some of this is not a long slog, but I do think like on election interference, a bunch of countries have now flipped the switch as they're seeing not those that are just victims, but others saying, wait, that could be us. And so I think we've seen some movement there. As for Defend Forward, similar to election to critical infrastructure, there's a problem of what does it mean? Like who does what, right? Like I think norms are most effective when they tell us who does what. What are you supposed to do? Or what are you not supposed to do? And with Defend Forward, it's been at our time and choosing, we will do something. And so it's hard to know if it's having normative traction. It may have real world effects, but I'm not sure yet it's moved from like international relations to a normative dialogue, except maybe in the fact that like you're not seeing the same sort of public accusations or responses from the victims of Defend Forward saying, hey, this was inappropriate. You shouldn't have done this, because that might have then forced them to say, yeah, we did this thing first, but your response was disproportionate or whatever. And so there may be something building where we're seeing some permissiveness around the Defend Forward at the state level. Certainly academics have written about it and raised concerns. So yeah, but good. Did I get all of them, or was there any?
No, that's perfect. I want to make sure we can at least get one or two more. Thank you.
And I can stick around. I know everybody else has to leave or whatever, but I'm happy to stick around if others have questions.
Duncan, that's great. So what I was going to suggest, this has been a great talk. We have 3 more questions in the queue. And so, I'll stop the recording after those 3 questions, and then people can do whatever they like at that point. So thanks for taking some extra time. Asif, please go ahead.
Hi, Duncan. Nice seeing you again. I have one tiny question about a more general kind of theoretical thought. One common criticism of the US privacy frameworks is that it's segmented and industry specific, that they say we need an omnibus privacy or cybersecurity data protection law because we've approached this through a HIPAA and a COPA and segmented our analysis. And I'm wondering, especially as one of the answers you gave, Michael, was that one of the benefits of a norm is that it can target specific group or certain problem sets. Are we not entering the same challenge? And is this a comparable critique that we are going to take this as on a segmented approach as opposed to a general regulatory framework like, say, Tallinn Manual?
Yeah, so I think, yes, I am kind of proposing a segmented approach, and maybe partly because of the political reality, right? Like my first ever piece on cyber was like, we need a global treaty that just solves all the problems, which is classic for, was not my tenure piece. It was a pre-tenure piece, but, and I still stand behind the idea that I actually think, we need new international law here. I haven't fallen off that, but I do think that, first of all, like climate change, right? Cybersecurity is not a single problem, right? It is a problem set. And so I think to actually effectively address it through regulation, you have to break it into its component problems, like, and there may be overlap and definitional issues and the like, but you have to, I think, break it out. And then if you break it out, you're going to try and, different actors can be more effective in dealing with certain problems. Like, social media companies are great for disinformation, but they're not going to actually do, a norm for them is not going to say much about like the security of actual election machinery, right? Like you need, different norms. Now, law and governments can do like an omnibus bill that does all that. I think politically, as for the very reasons you've raised, that would require, either coming up with something that cuts across all industries and then all the changes to HIPAA and the like that would be required. I also think from the US perspective, GDPR is kind of the antithesis of where the at least the last two administrations, not just this last administration, have wanted to go. And so, you know, I just, you know, I don't know that it's practical on it, but I take your point that we should be clear-eyed in that if we're going to go down a route where we're going to start to have small groups of actors forming norms, that they're going to enter into silos, and they're going to have siloed thinking that goes with it. And so I do think there does need to be complementary things like the Paris Call or others that try and cut across the groups, so there's visibility into what sort of norm making or law making is happening in different national level, industry level, civil society behavior, and the like, because otherwise you'll have kind of like competing norm silos or competing islands of normativity, which, by the way, may be where we're heading. Like on international law, I don't know if you would agree, you know, it certainly seems like we're kind of moving increasingly to the West is having this dialogue about, is sovereignty a rule or not? Is due diligence? It's like Russia and China aren't weighing it at all. And it's more like can we all, you know, the US, Finland, Netherlands, France, coalesce around a set of what we think the law says. And then we'll go have the fight with those who take a different view. So you know, we may also just, that's where we are. But great question.
And Hans Klein, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Duncan, for an extremely interesting talk. Really like the overview of law and technology and norms. We met, I'm at Georgia Tech, by the way, so I'm not local here. I have a question. Is there, the norm for international election interference, is there a pre-existing norm or customary norm almost that acknowledge that, hey, this happens, that this is what states do? So even as we look for a norm against that kind of interference, is there really already an established custom that states cross borders and interfere in other elections? And when you started your talk, you mentioned the historical chapter in the book, which I'm extremely interested to see. But I think that there's a long tradition of cross-border interference in elections. From reading some literature, although I haven't researched it, I think the U.S. has been, you know, one of the top actors in influencing elections abroad as part of its foreign policy. So are we already starting from a situation where that election interference happens, it's acknowledged, it's almost a custom? And if so, what would the new norms be? Would it be, are we looking for new norms that are specific to the cyber sector, or would there be a promulgation of a norm that that applies to all election influence and interference? And would the U.S. actually want such a norm if to date election influencing has been to our benefit, to our national interest?
It's a great question, Hans. Yeah, and I do remember, I think it was a Milton Mueller thing. So I have kind of two responses. One, specific to your great powers, is I think of election interference from a national security perspective as like espionage. We want no one to do it to us, and we want to be able to do it to everybody else, right? So that makes for a normatively difficult situation unless you have like a hegemonic regime where there's one rule for the hegemon and everybody else has a different set of rules. And so I think that's what we've seen traditionally. And like espionage, when it came to U.S. foreign election interference, the U.S. denied that it was engaged in the behavior, and refused to comment on its legality or illegality. Right? It was, I'm sure it was vetted under Title 10 and Title 50 or what have you in the U.S. from the U.S. lawyer's perspective, but international, you rarely saw the sort of justifications, or if they were justifications, they were made in the normal discourse of international law of this was collective self-defense. We were coming in to help a government ally who we'd promised to help. This was public diplomacy. We should be allowed to, buy pages in the of advertisements in your paper, and the ambassador should be able to write how much concern they are if party A wins the election over party B. So I think from a U.S. perspective, they've distanced themselves. I think the challenge for foreign election interference is the challenge of international law, is that we have certain stuff that's definitely off limits, right? If a state bombed another state's polling station during an election, violation of international law, nobody's going to disagree. And another, a public official says, we really like the existing government, we hope they stay in power. No one's going to really say, oh, that's out of bounds interference in our elections. Well, some might, but I think there's a range of polls where we see clearly permitted, clearly prohibited behavior. And then there's kind of a middle, and we've always had that middle. I think what cyber does is it's introduced all these new tools and techniques to do the sorts of things that have been done for centuries. And part of this whole conversation, whether it's from law or normative perspectives, is about defaults, right? Where do we put these disinformation campaigns? Do we default and say, oh, this is more like the stuff that was permitted in the past, so we're just going to default and assume it's okay? Or do we say, no, this is more like bombing a polling station and it's off limits? And that's hard in the gray zone, right? Like, and so I think we're kind of at the beginning of that conversation. And I've participated, like, for example, in a bunch of the Paris Call champions conversations, all post-pandemic, so all on Zoom, where people are really still wrestling with, how do we define interference? Like, what's in the electoral process bucket? What are we worried about? And how far, how much do you care about, like, all influence operations, or just those that are, more closely tied by causation and proximity to elections? And also, what are the things that we say should be interference, and what do we say, just like we let companies try and sell us their goods and persuade us, we should let other states put information into the public sphere and allow dialogue and discourse, kind of like Michael was saying in his question.
And then
for that, I don't have an answer. I think, like, unfortunately, we're at the beginning of that conversation, I think.
And for our last question, Jayati Dev.
Hello, thank you for your wonderful talk. I actually had a question about norms. I found that really interesting. I was wondering, what is your take on norms sort of across cultures? Because norms sort of vary across cultures and geographical areas. So how do you think we can enforce them when we try to look at the cyberspace more worldwide?
So I think, like, when we talk about norms, it's norms work and sometimes within an existing culture more easily, because there's already a shared identity where you can say, oh, if you're going to be a good US citizen, a member of the polity and the like, guess what? We have new behavioral expectations of you, and they've shifted, and here you go. And you kind of go along. But you're right. Like, if we're suddenly then asking someone, in Malaysia or what have you, they're going to have a different cultural perspective. So I think in some ways, when we're talking about these international norms, we're in sometimes talking about creating new communities, right? And I think that was like what the Paris Call was about. You certainly see that with computer emergency response teams, all these people coming from different cultures, but all having a new community built around their belief in the technology and in how they should, share information and how they should make decisions. We see that a lot when we talk about multi-stakeholderism, that there's like an ethos of rough consensus and running code is the famous phrase that the IGF and others used back in the day. And so I do think that what you're often talking about, and going back to one of the earlier Hans's question, like, it may depend on the problem set as to whether that's the best way to do it, or whether it makes sense to do it at the national level, and you're going to have much more effect if you take it nation by nation. But on some of this stuff, and international law and international norms, like don't interfere in foreign elections, the idea is to come up with a norm that says, let's abstract out beyond your culture to our common humanity, or our common, if you're a nation state, right? These are the things nation states do and don't do, right? You don't commit genocide, you don't interfere in foreign elections, you don't do slavery, and it doesn't matter what your underlying culture or your political form, political arrangement is, to be a state, this is the sort of behavior you have to engage in, or this is the behavior you can engage in. So I think it has potential, but you have to be, again, as I said, kind of strategic about it. If you're thinking about trying to construct norms, one of the first questions is, where am I going to try and draw the logic of appropriateness for this norm from, and to what community, existing or new, do I want to then extend it into?
So thanks for everybody's questions. I think Angie had to leave, but Duncan, I want to tell you on behalf of all of us at IU, the Ostrom Workshop, the CACR, and everyone, thank you for taking time during an incredibly busy time. Your talk was great. I'm going to stop recording now. Obviously, if people would like to stick around, and Duncan, everybody is free to do what they like, but thank you so much, Duncan.
Yeah, no, thanks to CACR for having me. Crazy times for all of us, but thanks for your patience in listening to me, and hopefully not spending the whole time on Twitter. I look forward. I think I'm having a couple of individual sessions with some of you going forward, and I'm looking forward to those as well. So it's fun to be a virtual visitor.
Thank you so much. Hopefully in person next year.
Great.
Thanks.